Hello and welcome to today's event, 5G Ready, Preparing Your Organization for the Future. This is Otto Dahl, Senior Fellow with the Center for Digital Government. I'm excited to serve as the host for today's event and just want to say thank you for joining us. I know we're in for an informative session over the next hour. Before we begin, I have a couple of brief housekeeping notes. A recording of this presentation will be emailed to all registrants within 48 hours. You can use the recording for your reference or feel free to pass along to colleagues. This webcast is designed to be interactive, and you can participate in Q&A with us by asking questions at any time during the presentation. You should see a Q&A box on the bottom left of the presentation panel. Please send in your questions as they come up throughout our time. We will address as many of these questions as we can during the webinar today. If you would like to download a PDF of the slides for this presentation, you can do so by clicking the Webinar Resources widget at the bottom of the console. You'll also find other useful resources for this discussion, including an infographic and thought leadership paper produced in partnership with Verizon and the Center for Digital Government. Also, during today's webinar, you will be able to connect with your peers via LinkedIn and Twitter. Please use hashtag GovTechLive to connect with your peers across the government technology platform via Twitter. At the close of the webinar, we encourage you to complete a brief survey about the presentation. We'd like to hear what you think. If you are unable to stay with us for the entire webinar but would like to complete the survey as much as you're able, please click the survey widget at the bottom of the screen to launch the survey. Otherwise, it will pop up once the webinar concludes. At this time, we recommend you disable your pop-up blockers, and if you are experiencing any media player issues or have any other problems, please visit our webcast help guide by clicking on the help button at the bottom of the console. Joining me today are Danny Johnson, Director of Product Marketing for Verizon, and Bob Woolley, another Senior Fellow here at the Center for Digital Government and former Chief Technical Architect for the State of Utah's Department of Technology Services. Danny Johnson, a 20-plus year veteran in the technology industry, is a seasoned executive possessing experience in software development, engineering, sales, consulting, product development, and marketing. Danny has started and launched innovative products and solutions into multi-billion-dollar markets and is currently Director of Product Marketing for Verizon, where he shares responsibility for the profitable growth of Verizon's strategic network portfolio. Danny holds a Bachelor of Science degree in electrical engineering and is very active in a variety of outreach programs within his community. Joining Danny is also Bob Woolley, who was the Chief Technical Architect for the State of Utah's Department of Technology Services, including the development of the state's utah.gov portal. Utah has been widely recognized in these areas with numerous national awards. He has also been a technical lead and RFP writer for the WSCA NASPO Cloud and Data Communication procurements. Bob has experience with state, county, and higher education employee skill assessments and technology upgrade implementations. He has worked in the public sector as a university professor and systems analyst, and in the corporate world as a company president and enterprise architect. Bob has a master's degree from Utah State University. He was named as one of Government Technology Magazine's top 25 doers, dreamers, drivers for 2013, and has specialized in applying new emerging technology solutions to government. For the remainder of the presentation today, I'm going to be saying a few words to sort of set the stage for the digital transformation journey that we're going to talk about today. And then we're going to have Danny talk to us about SD-WAN and your path to a 5G future, followed by Bob, who will talk to making the transition to a future-ready organization. We will then move into a panel discussion talking about how one moves forward in a new digital environment that we find ourselves in today. And then finally, we will close with an audience question and answer period. When I look at the area of networking, there's been a tremendous amount of change that's gone on, and I was thinking about what really drives us to get to much faster connectivity, the ability to manage our networks in ways that support what actually is going on with government jurisdictions and really the business community as well. And I think one of the big changes that we've seen the last 10 years is whether you're a city, county, state, the federal government, we are digitizing our spaces, our communities, our jurisdictions. And you can see from the list on the right, which is just a partial list, there's a lot of information that cities are and counties and states and the feds are collecting. It's not always about what we can see, if you will. There's also a lot that's going on below ground. And it's really important that government jurisdictions manage all of that infrastructure that makes up society, but also manage the use of and the delivery of appropriate information and data so that people, particularly those out in the field, can get their work done. And I think another dynamic that's also driving us today is the fact that we are sensorizing a lot of our infrastructure in government. I think people recognize, people are going out and they are putting flow meters in water systems and sewer systems to understand what's going on, to spot challenges that might be occurring and hopefully catch them before problems are there. People are putting up pollution monitors. There are the advent of autonomous vehicles is going to put a great need on information to be delivered to those vehicles as they move around our communities, around our jurisdictions. And so there's a lot of information that's being created real time and being driven out to ultimately the workforce of our governments. And I kind of view this as really, though, a two-sided coin of where jurisdictions are using their apps and their data. The first is empowering that workforce. There's a lot of parts of government where the vast majority of organizations are actually out in the field. And you look at police departments, fire departments, EMS, there's lots of inspectors out there for doing various things like health inspections, construction inspections, and the like. And so there's a real need to get information in a timely manner to people out in the field at the point of their actual work. The flip side of that coin is the fact that we also are there for our constituencies. We are engaging with citizens. We're engaging with the business community. They're just not transactions. A lot of times it's just information requests. The whole area in the last 12 years or so of open data and delivering vast quantities of data, et cetera, is really driving a lot of information to be spread out to citizens and also businesses. And of course, government itself actually pushes data amongst itself. And so a jurisdiction's network infrastructure needs to support this ever-increasing data traffic. It needs to be secure at all times. We need to be able to prioritize that information flow, et cetera. And so today, on today's call, what we'd like to do is talk about how we can prepare for this future. And our speakers will discuss this digital transformation journey that we're all on. And without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Danny.
Great. Thank you very much, Otto, and always great to be here with you all. Thank you for taking time out of your day today to join us as we have this discussion around preparing your organization for the future. The context really being 5G ready. There also is going to be kind of an underpinning around this, and I'm going to talk to three key particular areas. One is I'm going to provide some context on 5G. I'll talk about within the context of 5G, its attributes and why it really matters. And then secondly, I'm going to touch on how SD-WAN is a critical transition step towards really taking advantage of 5G and all the great features, attributes, and benefits 5G will afford for you in your own business and operations. And then lastly, I'm going to go through some use cases to really touch on some possibilities that exist within both a software-defined world as well as a 5G-enabled environment. And there is linkage between the two. And so without any further ado there, I'm going to go ahead and start here and as it pertains to just what we've done. So as a company, Verizon, as you know, we really emphasize the value of our partnerships with the industry, with our customers like you. And suffice it to say that we continue to make a lot of significant investments within our operating model, within our networks, within all of the platforms that we really look to bring to bear within the marketplace and also to provide to customers like you. In that regard, we have 5G, and many of you are, if not all, are familiar. You've all heard of 5G, whether you're watching TV or reading a trade rag or both in print and digitally, you're probably going to see some reference to 5G all over the place. And we've made some pretty significant announcements in the past week as well as years. And if you've heard or read anything as it pertains to 5G specific to kind of Verizon's deployments, you'll have noticed that there are 8 currencies that are critical to really enable the effectiveness of 5G. And within those 8 currencies, there's an aspect of ultra-wideband. And the reason why these 8 currencies then become critical is because this presents at an ultra-wideband level, so the higher frequency kind of spectrum that we're operating at, a stepwise function change in performance as it pertains to 3G and even 4G. And why this matters is because this really introduces a variety of use cases that you'll hear me talk about a little bit later, and then also Bob talk about as well, as it pertains to how your organizations, your agencies can really begin to benefit. To kind of put it into perspective, the 3G and 4G world had a very heavy emphasis on kind of the mobile environments, the devices, the performance on those. You moved into 4G, you got much higher data rates between 3G and 4G, where now one could contemplate kind of converging solutions like voice and data. 5G kind of begins to open the aperture on the use cases to be very solution-centric, so business operations agency-centric versus consumer-centric. And you think about then some of the elements of latency. It takes roughly 250 to 300 milliseconds for the human to blink an eye. Okay, and with latency characteristics associated with 5G, now we're starting to talk about less than 10 milliseconds. So imagine that for just a minute. And as Otto teed up, as you begin to think about how you enable your environment, sensorizing all of the things that can be sensorized from an IoT perspective, your smart community applications as an example, and all the things associated with that, to be able to start collecting the data there, making real-time decisions, you are really going to need to have a millisecond, sub 10 milliseconds the latency characteristics in order to support that. Imagine, again, if faster than a human can blink an eye. And the reason why this is important is for a variety of reasons. One is there's a massive amount of data that Otto talked about a little bit earlier that must be consumed. And it's not just the data, it's what to do with that data in terms of making real-time decisions. If you think about automating a vehicle or some otherwise inanimate object for purely safety reasons, right? You want to make sure that decisions can be made in real time. Okay, so latency becomes a very important characteristic. Throughput also, right? So you think about throughput in terms of now being able to really support massive amount of speeds, okay, stepwise, up to 10 gigs, in terms of just what the technology can support, becomes very critical. Why? Because now you have this other environment around connected devices where you have over 1 million, hundreds of millions of devices that really need to begin to interact together. Well, you're going to need to have the right environment enabled by 5G in order to support that many devices with the capacity you need with the latency characteristics required. Now, in addition, the mobility aspect becomes very critical as well. And what we mean by mobility is the fact that in order for connectivity to be able to support it at high rates of speed, you need the characteristics that 5G enables. So we've seen tests that would that keep vehicles, as an example, connected at speeds north of 300 miles an hour. Okay, so that becomes very critical. And as you can see, there are some obvious implications as to what possibilities may exist when you think about smart communities and automated vehicles and other things that begin to move. And then the other elements are really associated around reliability and energy efficiency. When you think about now bringing edge compute into the mix and you begin to offload the compute resources from a device, then your devices or your connected things, your sensors, have to worry less about processing, which means battery life really begins to expand. And so your device, whether it's a mobile device or your thing that's connected, your sensor, it can last much longer and is really, if you're a mobile device, if you have a mobile device, can really be more concentrated on the presentation layer of what kind of outputs you're looking to monitor there. Now, all of these particular characteristics begin to usher in this notion of the real-time enterprise. And as you can see, there are certain elements as it pertains to what the real-time enterprise really begins to be comprised of. One would be the attributes, the currencies that I just talked about. The other would be the massive compute environment. Okay, and we talked a little bit about, we're going to talk a little bit more in just a few slides about compute elements closer to the users and within the environments. And the other becomes more about people and process. When you begin to consolidate all of these different elements, now you have the making of an environment that can not only scale, but can also consume massive amount of information, data, and otherwise, and turn them into some level of analytical engine so that you can make real-time decisions on the spot. That becomes very transformational, especially when you think about then the platforms that can begin to be introduced, okay? So you think about, for instance, the intelligent videos. Today, you have video use cases that are really aligned with safety, perhaps learning environments, and others, okay? And today, you have these video environments. By and large, they'll sit separately. There's some monitoring capabilities associated with them. Well, what if you could begin to turn your video environment into an analytical engine? What I mean by that is now being able to leverage even the pixels of a video as an input stream, combine that with other raw data feeds from other sources, and begin to make decisions. Okay, that becomes possibility now with 5G and mobile edge compute within the video analytics context. If you're at an airport, as an example, and these are actually some airports are looking at doing these things, and you are looking at consumers within your airport, wouldn't it be helpful to know, as an airport, if, okay, this person has some characteristics of they might be lost, and to be able to kind of begin to make decisions based on, okay, if this person's lost, I want to send somebody to that person to help them in their experience, to get them where they need to go. And so video becomes very transformational. And by the way, it wouldn't even necessarily require anybody to buy new video equipment. This now becomes the benefit of the compute environment. From an artificial intelligence and machine learning perspective, now AI machine learning, this exists even without 5G. If you're somebody like a FedEx who has, a pretty massive supply chain, right? They're using some level of AI even within their environment, and there's some level of manual intervention where they have used and really perfected the whole supply chain model. We get packages and we know it works and we get it on time. What 5G and the 5G enabled technology stack then further afford is the ability to really create even more automation and kind of supercharge that environment, where perhaps there would be added benefit of more efficiency, less error, and decisions that are made in real time. Lastly, and this is kind of cool, when you think about immersive creation and consumption, being able to kind of present experiences, whether that's citizen experiences, whether that's education and student experiences, in a very immersive environment, right? So consider this. If you're a student in a classroom and you have very traditional ways of learning, which are great today. You have PowerPoints, you have a great teacher or professor, you have books that you're reading through. You're going to learn X. So there have actually been neuroscience studies, learning science development studies that have kind of validated some of these. To the extent now that you can bring virtual reality and augmented reality, and so now engaging all the senses of a student or an individual. So imagine now taking a field trip to the Amazon or visiting the Great Wall of China, and you're actually now immersed in that experience where you actually can hear the sounds around you. Maybe look up and see the canopy of the forest. Maybe look down and see kind of, wow, I'm standing on top of a pretty significant piece of edifice, this wall, and now you're immersed in the experience. You'll learn 8x what you learned traditionally. And some of the studies suggest that even you'll remember 80% in well over a year's time, because you were able to engage your senses. That becomes pretty significant when you're able to do that. Now, the interesting thing is, in order to make these VR and AR capabilities work, you really need high capacity and low latency characteristics. Because as you know, if your senses in a VR environment don't match with what you're seeing with what you feel, you get very nauseous, right? We've all been there. I know I do. So delay and latency becomes very significant there, and so to the extent that we can bring very low latency applications into the learning environment, really enables there to be this level of enhancement in terms of being able to create these immersive experiences from a learning perspective. Now, one of the things that has also been critical in kind of the deployments of 5G and really being able to land on some of these use cases and the platforms and the technology elements that we've talked about has been the fact that we've worked very hard in co-innovation, standing up labs to really kind of vet out what the art of the possible here is. And so we've been very, very diligent and very focused on bringing some of these labs into the marketplace. We have labs that are very specific to certain use cases, and some of them very, very targeted for government. So we've got labs in our Washington, D.C. area that are really, really specific solely for government and cities as well as first responders. And we know that even from a government perspective, there's quite often an interest as to what others are doing in the enterprise business, and the government has retail use cases as well. There are immersive experiences that we have in certain labs also just focused on those. And so we continue to co-innovate with our customers and industry within these environments to really, really kind of land on additional use cases, expand the art of the possible, and also to help bring you all in with us. So there's an opportunity always to be able to demonstrate what in real life what what possibilities exist within a 5G and edge-enabled context. And then this becomes critically important because quite often the question becomes, well, what do I need to be thinking about? So 5G isn't necessarily pervasive at this point. It will be here in the next coming years. But how do I need to be thinking about what I need to do to be ready? And that can be really established in 5 key steps. And these steps are really outlined here in terms of, first, you got to think about how you want to start, right? And that really begets this notion of how do you baseline your existing environment, right? How do you assess where your existing operating environment really is today so that you can start making decisions as to how you begin to transform? The other then is adapt. How do you begin to implement some of these things, these technologies, perhaps in a non-production environment? And then as you look to kind of kick the tires on the technology, begin to introduce them into your production environment where you now can elevate that, on a much broader scale. And then you enter the innovation stage. This is where now some of the full-blown compute characteristics become to really be contemplated and be implemented within your particular environment. So you think about some of the IoT smart community use cases. You think about some of the medical virtual reality-based use cases. Those begin to introduce themselves here in this particular innovation kind of stage. And then lastly, it's the disrupt stage. This begins to beget the element of, okay, guess what? I'm ready to kind of scale this beyond just my current environment, on a much broader scale. Now, kind of bringing it back to one of the practical things that you can consider today, and that is the introduction of SD WAN. Why is this important? This is a technology that is available today, but one of the things that you really need to think about is how do you transition from today's operating model into a more software-defined programmable model? And that's where SD WAN comes in. And the reason why this is important is because, as you heard Otto share before, as you think about contextually the sensorization of your environments, the applications also that now are riding over their environments, how do you then create policies to really enable the quality and the performance of those applications? That's where SD-WAN comes into the picture. And what SD-WAN, as many of you may or may not know, enables you to do is to really make intelligent decisions based on policy, based on your application environment. So you may have some application, as an example, that are mission critical, and you may have some that aren't. Well, what SD-WAN really helps you do is based on policies, being able to identify those applications and find the best route to be able to support those applications. Think of SD-WAN almost like your GPS application, your Waze application, as an example. If you're on the road, you type in your destination, Waze, or Google Maps will find the best route to that destination and direct you accordingly. And so SD-WAN really enables that particular environment. Now, what that also does then, it really helps you, as I mentioned before, gain some network efficiencies, okay? And really, candidly, this becomes kind of that next practical step for you to be ready for 5G. And the reason why that is because now you've got to ensure that you have some level of flexibility within your environment to be able to prioritize based on the type of highway metaphor that you may want your applications to reside in. Now, one important aspect here is that SD-WAN also begets now you moving to kind of a virtual environment as well. Okay, and there are some critical components as to how that is enabled, and that's enabled through the delivery of servers that can be virtualized so that you can deliver and deploy applications within that context. So in other words, traditionally today you buy an application for a server, an application that fits a particular piece of CPE for application 1, application 2, same thing, application 3, same thing. So now you're scaling your capital investments, and you're also buying hardware that's dedicated to a particular software function. In today's world now with SDN, you can begin to virtualize all those applications in a single form factor within that CPE environment, which does a couple things. It helps you manage your costs, but it also enables you to be able to deliver even network services like software. And the reason why this becomes important is because now as you begin to introduce different use cases for your applications, you begin to kind of map these to network slices within a 5G environment, right? Now this is kind of a little bit future in terms of the network slices. That said, you can still do a subset of this today with existing networks and with existing SD-WAN existing SD-WAN policies. And so the point here is that with 5G, you have super big highways. Big highways, bigger than you ever had before. And what network slicing enables you to do is dynamically create lanes within that highway with perhaps different speed limits, okay? And you do it dynamically based on the applications and policies you want to create. SD-WAN works very nicely in that network slicing world, but you'll never get that unless you make that first step in moving to SD-WAN today. All right, so just to kind of wrap up, you've got a variety of use cases that I've already talked about, some of which are smart communities. When you think about the amount of sensors that would exist within a smart communities use case, you're going to need a massive compute environment. You're going to need the attributes that the 8 currencies of 5G afford you in order to be able to process all of the data coming from all of these data inputs to make real-time decisions. You also think about from a public safety perspective. Same principles apply from a platform view. Being able to turn video, into an analytical engine, being able to infuse next generation communication and also assets now that you can also sensorize to be able to make real-time decisions, not only to be safe, but also to prioritize, perhaps even in times when there may be a lot of congestion, to be able to ensure that the applications that you need to support in those times are supported when you need them. And then lastly, from an education perspective, I talked a little bit about some of the use cases from an education perspective. Imagine the possibility to be able to create very immersive capabilities and environments for learning. Students will learn in a much different dimension when all the senses can really be engaged within that learning experience. And then lastly, in closing, we're going to continue. This is a journey for us, and it's a journey that we have with our partners, many of you and all of you on this call today, with the marketplace as well as our customers, where we're going to continue to be very committed from a learning perspective. We have a lot of activities that are very specific to educating, and not only from a general education perspective and the broader communities, but also from an industry perspective as well. We're going to continue in that regard. We'll not stop. We're really in the middle of a great disruptive time from a technology perspective, and I think there's yet more to come. We can only think about what the art of the possible might be as we move further into this 5G-enabled world. And with that, I will hand it to you.
Hey, thanks, Danny. And up next is Bob, and all yours, Bob.
Thank you, Otto. As we sit in state governments and other government entities, listen to lots of new technology buzz come up, you always wind up asking yourself the question, is any of this stuff real? And based on all of my research and my experience, SD-WAN is very real, and software-defined networking has been real for some time. And it's one of the really rapid growth areas over the next little while. As we look at 5G as a rollout, it's probably best to characterize 5G rollouts across the country as more of a marathon than a sprint. It's something that will take time, but there's a great deal of other broadband infrastructure that SD-WAN can leverage that's there today. So from a practical perspective, why does SD-WAN matter? One of the things that we noticed in Utah government of all kinds is people, when they're working, sometimes they're not in the office, they want access to their same stuff, and they want it now. So there's a real opportunity for leveraging existing broadband transport as part of a managed service. Provisioning new direct purchase circuits all over the state of Utah is an extremely expensive proposition. Leveraging broadband is much less expensive, so it cuts overall service costs to distributed locations. I have one agency in the state of Utah that has 115 branch offices. That's a fairly complex information environment where they all need the same information, they need it now. So optimizing performance and availability across the network, without a location penalty. What I like to think of as equality of service really is it matters. Being able to integrate with cloud service providers, having a complete picture of increased application visibility, all of these things really make a difference in how people and how customers consume state information and county information. Security service, lots of limitations. MPLS is a very secure environment, but has a lot of access issues. There's some very significant opportunities for SD-WAN with security, right down to security zones. Next generation firewall services, unified threat management, all of these things make a difference. And then one of the others that I think is important is we have tended in state government to spend a lot of money on hardware and then tightly couple it to circuits from a network perspective. That's a CapEx intensive experience. State of Utah alone has more than 1,500 switches and routers. There are opportunities to handle that differently. So when you look at it from an access perspective, what are we really looking at that SD-WAN brings to us that we think is important from a customer perspective and from a state employee perspective? One is end-to-end segmentation. We want to remove the friction. We want to make use of the application just easy. Automate user access policies. As far as the user is concerned, see the network as a single fabric. We want to hide all the chaos behind the curtain and make it really easy for the customer. When you look at business drivers, in a word, one of my biggest driver, at least in a state like Utah, and we have some areas where we only have 3 people per square mile, so that's kind of a problem with dedicated circuits. We want to be able to meet customer needs for service, new modernization guidelines and security requirements. Remote customers want the same experience as customers are in metro areas. We want to be able to extend SD-WAN functionality to remote offices. That agency I mentioned with 115 branches, that's a big issue. We want to be able to seamlessly integrate world-class security into SD-WAN. A lot of security is one-off, and some of it, frankly, isn't always the best in our current environments. We want to leverage multi-broadband. Some of the remote areas of the state may be a long time getting 5G, but they may have 4G right now. We should be able to leverage that. Provisioning circuits is extremely expensive. We want to reduce operating expense. We want to improve application performance. We want to cut back on complexity and then be able to maintain the integrity of data and resources being used. Now, when you talk about getting started with an SD-WAN approach, there's some things that really matter. One of the things, I was in a meeting with Jeff Bezos once, someone asked him what the future of Amazon looked like, and he said only 2 things. First, he said he didn't know, but then the other thing he said that I thought was really interesting, he said, from my perspective, I don't believe any customers are going to want to get their product more slowly, and I don't think they're going to want to pay more for it. Those 2 pieces then become big drivers of Amazon performance. From a networking perspective, some very similar parallels. Customers want to be able to use state resources from wherever they are. Really makes a difference to them. They don't want to pay more for it. They expect great flexibility. So as we look at how we get started with an SD-WAN approach, you need a holistic strategy. You need to begin with the end in mind. What does that outcome look like once we've really done this for the customer and for state employees? Addressing financial considerations is a big deal. I mentioned the state of Utah has more than 1,500 routers and switches. A lot of people perceive the migration to SD-WAN to be a forklift upgrade. That's really not accurate. But we do need to take into consideration the impact of depreciation expense and other things that hit IT budgets. Do a cost-benefit analysis over the depreciation life of your existing network infrastructure. Look at intangible benefits. What do you gain that brings customer joy and happiness by improving this process? How do you communicate those benefits to stakeholders? Look at an integrated management approach and then make security a big priority. And with that in mind, that concludes my comments. I'll turn it back to you, Otto.
Hey, thanks, Bob. Now we're going to move into our panel discussion with our speakers. And I'd like to start by let's talk first about the SD-WAN world, since that paves the way for the 5G future. We talked about the technology characteristics of SD-WAN and I think we touched on some examples, and I think we should maybe dive a little bit more into, what are some of the advantages for government agencies and departments that the SD-WAN technology supports. And I was wondering if we could start with Danny's, what you guys are seeing in Verizon's world.
Yeah, I think there are a few advantages for agencies and departments in terms of SD-WAN. One is, and Bob touched on some of these as well, being able to even leverage existing investments in broadband or other connectivity means to be able to really support your growing application requirements. And by that, I mean really the quality of the applications that you are continuing to develop or are seeking to develop within your agency or department. I think also it introduces the possibility to introduce other capabilities, in terms of how you begin to connect to either other agencies, how you begin to connect to your cloud environments, or how you begin to connect, broadly within your own kind of agency platforms. And that is, you think about things like wireless technologies that you can begin to introduce, as a viable means of connectivity. You think about being able to create a primary, secondary, even tertiary means of connectivity to ensure you have a really sound continuity of operations perspective. I think the other benefit is just the ability to manage costs. Right? So now you're going to maximize and optimize your investments as it pertains to, number one, how you're going to support your application environment, but then also number two, as I mentioned before, to the extent you can begin to think about virtualizing your application environment, now you begin to manage your capital expenditures. You can begin to move into more of a, perhaps even an operating OpEx type of model in beginning to deploy services. And then lastly, it's the quality of the applications, that end user experience that really, I think, you're going to see some of the most material benefits.
Okay. Have anything you'd like to add, Bob?
Well, yeah, I think there are a couple of things that come up. I think the ability to leverage any combination of transport services really makes a difference. I think the fact that most states and counties are moving more and more toward cloud deployments, traditional WANs generally are not very cloud friendly. So there's a real opportunity with SD-WAN to begin to use the cloud and leverage those resources. The other one that I kind of like is we tend to create networks in states, by counties, by cities, by state. There's an opportunity with SD-WAN to begin to link some of them together and share resources more effectively. To me, that's an exciting potential.
Yeah, that's a good one too, for sure.
Yeah. Any advice for folks out there on whether they should look to managing their SD-WAN in-house or use a managed service provider?
I think there's the answer is. So go ahead.
Go ahead.
Somewhat neutral. Yeah, go ahead.
The answer is twofold, and that is it really depends. Okay, and it depends on a number of factors. One is to the extent that you have the resources, the engineering resources to deploy a technology like this. I can tell you that when you begin to introduce other applications and into the mix, so we've mentioned your cloud environment, growing cloud environments, your growing application environment, perhaps even your growing connectivity environment, the SD-WAN deployments can become a little bit more complex in terms of how do you design the interaction between those environments. And so in that case, if you really want to be more focused on developing kind of policies around your strategies and developing your digital transformation strategy and really spending more time on your citizen experiences or your operational outcomes, you may want to consider partnering with somebody who can manage that operational environment for you. If you feel like you have the staff to be able to kind of support some of these within your own purview and operating environment, and you have the time commitment to spend there, there could be some consideration to do it yourself. We're finding that many of our customers are really looking for a partner to help them manage that particular environment. Bob, I don't know if you have any other insights there as well.
Yeah, I did have some comment on it too. Having done a number of large enterprise implementations with tens of thousands of users, my experience has been that working with an MSP or a consulting organization to roll things out gives you faster time to benefit. If you look at IT budgets, generally the total dollars available to do innovation and new implementations is fairly limited, probably less than 15% of total spend on a good day, and that gets chopped up a lot of ways. So it's very, very hard for states to just simply jump in and do this huge lift and huge change, real or perceived. So my sense is that the best combination is to bring in an MSP as a consultant or as a provider ongoing, and then work closely with the people to understand the fixed network infrastructure, to understand the circuits and how everything works. Then you have a real win, and your time to benefit for the customer is much better.
Yeah. Let's switch over to 5G, and I think one of the questions people out there must have is, so, you know, when and where is 5G going to be brought to fruition? I know as CIO for the city of Minneapolis, we had the benefit of a pending 2018 Super Bowl, so we got 5G towards the end of 2017. And so I was wondering, Danny, how would you describe the rollout of 5G?
You're right. I will describe it in two ways. One is we, in Verizon, we've begun to already deploy 5G nationwide, as you probably have heard, over the wires in a variety of different manifestations. You've heard our CEO share that we're going to deploy 30 cities in mobility by the end of this year. We are still on target to do that. We're at 18 right now. We're going to have another batch for sure before the end of this month. We also have already rolled out 5G fixed wireless access from a home perspective on the consumer side of the market, and we're going to continue to roll those out as well. And then lastly, we've in partnership with AWS, this was part of a big announcement last week, we have rolled out 5G Edge, which infuses now the 5G components and the edge compute, and we've got some customers onboarded doing some pilots with us in the city of Chicago. So we're going to continue to deploy those nationwide and even beyond, you know, in the coming years, and we'll continue to work with other municipalities as a part of those rollouts. That becomes very critical. That goes kind of unnoticed and unadvertised in terms of the work and the conversations that take place with the cities, the local municipalities, and the like. And so we're going to continue to see that take place in that evolution, and you'll certainly hear about that. Now, I think the other dimension is the partnerships, right? And I think this is where it's very critical in the collaboration element. You know, so we continue to really drive and promote collaboration with state agencies, with state departments, and others to really also do two things. One is introduce kind of the environment, and so that way agencies, departments, and the like can see a 5G in action, but then also to co-innovate, to really begin to expand the aperture on what other possibilities may exist within a 5G environment. And we've seen a lot of fruits as a result of that collaboration. So we're going to continue along both of those fronts. Our deployments in mobile as well as fixed wireless access and edge compute, while also partnering with our customers like you on this call to co-innovate.
Okay, cool. I was wondering, what sort of policies along those lines that Danny was mentioning, what sort of policies would be important for jurisdictions to consider to help the telecommunications industry implement 5G? I know most definitely as a CIO and bringing in public works and so forth to what was really going to have to happen with infrastructure within the city to support this new technology. What advice would you have for our audience?
Sorry, was that directed towards me as well? Otto, happy to dive in.
Yeah, might as well start, and then if Bob has had some experience.
Yeah, I'll have comments on that.
Okay. Go ahead, Bob.
When you look at this, there are a number of things that localities can do and governments can do. But one of the big ones, from my perspective, is give the IT provisioning organization some room. If they're continually funded on a CapEx level and they may want to go into a managed service environment, give them some OpEx flexibility. That makes a big, big difference. Gives some preference to consuming operational services as opposed to having to build our own stuff and buy hardware all the time. That becomes a fairly significant policy issue. And also, physical transport is at huge cost to government. If there's a way around doing that, huge benefits there. So I think that's something that states can really do. The other thing is we can take it to the point where we actually give some preference to software-defined networking approaches and leveraging existing broadband. And that can be done on a policy level. Similarly, security policies can be updated to leverage some of the capabilities that we find only in SD WAN and SDN services. All of those have a big impact, in government. IT on all levels can begin to enter into and engage in each one of those.
Okay. Any additional thoughts, Danny?
No, I think those are spot on, from as Bob shared, and I think one of the things that really kind of evolve in all of those contexts and aspects that Bob shared is just the partnership element. I think to the extent that we can continue partnering together, really kind of will help drive the best result and the best outcome for the agencies, for the partners, for the municipalities, and beyond.
Yeah. Well, since we're getting close to the end of our time today, let's jump right into some questions from the audience. Many of you have been asking about getting copies of today's presentation. Within the next 48 hours, Government Technology will provide all attendees with a link to the recording for your reference or for you to share with your colleagues. Okay, so let's get to our first question here. Someone is asking, if I am understanding correctly, then how long does the transition from SD-WAN to 5G take? Any references to the timeline to implementation of 5G capabilities?
So I think the dependency there is then when 5G would be available within the particular market you might be in, as well as the edge compute. So in all transparency, we're looking at broader ubiquity, especially within the business and government segments, probably into 2020 and beyond, right? And so I think the point here then is, in advance of that, knowing that it will be coming, how do you need to think about things now? And one of them is, number one, really be thinking about your digital transformation strategy. So it becomes less about how long it takes to move from SD-WAN to 5G. It's really then what's your digital strategy, what your transformation strategy. SD-WAN should be a part of that. And then once you have moved into that SD-WAN environment, and that could take, the dependency is how large your environment may be, right? And what your specific needs are in terms of your operational considerations, the potential disruption, perhaps, that we need to think about in moving from your current state to an SD-WAN enabled state. Once you get there, then the transition to 5G then becomes much easier, right? Because now it's more about adding technology into that software-defined environment. That becomes a much easier lift than having to completely change your operating environment to begin with. So step number one really ought to be focused on moving from your traditional environment into a software-enabled one.
And I'd comment on that as well, and that is, I think from a government perspective, the complex networking environments we have today just simply won't scale. And so the offering to move to something that's simpler and that will scale is really important.
Yep.
Yeah. Got another question, and I'll direct this first to Danny. How does one open access fiber optic infrastructure constructed by public or municipal entities fit into telecoms building out 5G networks?
So I think that's where the whole notion of partnerships really then becomes more of a material factor. I'm going to answer that in two dimensions. Dimension number one is fiber, and I'm gonna guess that you already know this because of the question. Fiber is a critical aspect, of being able to provide 5G. In order to have big, wide wireless pipes and highways, you have to have big, wide wireline pipes and highways, and that's fiber. And it's one of the reasons why you've seen us invest 5+ years ago. We started that investment in fiber, rolling out our own fiber strands, and put in perspective, we're deploying over 1,700 strands, per kind of right away. It's massive, So from a pure technology perspective, fiber becomes very critical. Now, that said, dimension number two, in terms of how does open access fiber optic infrastructure begin to marry, I think that's where partnerships then and discussions have to come into play. Right now, we Verizon, we're deploying it on the fiber infrastructure that we have, and the reason is because there's a critical reference architecture from a technology perspective that really begins to interact with how we can deploy the service. I'll give you an example. The recommendation that we've made for you to think about moving to a software-enabled world in order to be ready for 5G, we had to do the same thing. We started this process 4+ years ago where we had to also software enable our entire network and operating environment in order to be able to deliver 5G. So we've made those considerations. And so it's not a really precise answer other than these are discussions that really would need to have on a partnership level. It's not even a technology discussion, I'll be honest with you, as it pertains to what possibilities might exist to begin to think about how those two environments could begin to interoperate.
Okay. Yeah, got another question here, and I direct this first to Bob. Audience member is asking, what's the role of identity management and privacy in an SD-WAN 5G fabric?
Well, they're critical, obviously. One of the things that's interesting about an SD-WAN environment is if you look at a whole collection of state applications, local applications, you'll find some that have very, very severe requirements for privacy, security, guaranteed delivery, but it's a very small number. And when you look at what you can do with SD-WAN, you have the potential of creating security zones based upon the unique requirements of an application for security and or delivery. That's a really big advantage. Right now, we kind of take almost a one-size-fits-all approach on occasion. It's really not very effective. So I see SD-WAN as providing some really significant opportunity to fine-grain security and privacy considerations.
Okay. Anything you'd like to add, Danny?
No, I think Bob covered that quite nicely.
Okay. Okay. Well, I want to be respectful of our 1-hour commitment, so we'll have to wrap it up here. In closing, I would like to just thank everyone for joining us for today's event. A big thank you needs to go to my fellow speakers, Danny and Bob. And also, special thanks to our partners at Verizon for enabling us to bring this discussion to our audience today. Thanks once again, and we look forward to seeing you again soon at another government technology event. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.